A lot is made of how successful the major families in wrestling have been over the generations. And sure, when you think of names like the Harts, the Anoa'is, or the McMahons, it's certainly hard to deny this is the case. That said, there is one wrestling dynasty which has been able to build up a name for itself more quietly throughout both the 20th and 21st centuries. And the fact that it's gone so relatively under the radar is even more impressive when you consider the fact that, amongst its lineage, it boasts multiple world champions, Hall of Famers, and arguably the most talked about figure in WWE today. Who are we talking about? Why, the Windham family, of course. So with that said then, join us today as we take a deep dive into their entire family history as we go all the way from Blackjack to Bray in the Windhams, Wrestling's Greatest Families, Episode 5. The story of the Windham wrestling family can be traced all the way back to November 25, 1942, as it was then that the patriarch Robert DeRoy Windham would be born in Sweetwater, Texas. And growing up there, Robert would become quite the star athlete, with him playing football while studying at Texas Western College, all before then serving a tour in the United States Marine Corps upon graduating. Once he was done with this, though, he'd return to the gridiron once more when he briefly played for the New York Jets during the 1966 preseason. And it was also around this time that the youngster would first fall under the radar of legendary territory figure Wahoo McDaniel, with the former Mid-Atlantic heavyweight champion here urging Windham to begin training in the ring as, according to him, he had much more potential to become a star there than he did playing football. So quickly deciding to take Wahoo up on this offer, the Sweetwater native would spend a period training under both Joe Blanchard in Corpus Christi and then Vern Gagne in Minneapolis. And it was while in the latter city that he'd get his first big break in the ring when he began performing for the American Wrestling Association. Of course, with this being the territory days, the idea of staying in one location for too long was something few people entertained, and so, once he'd proved that he could carry himself in the ring, Robert would move over to New York, where he started working for Vince McMahon Sr.'s Worldwide Wrestling Federation under the new moniker of Blackjack Mulligan. And here, playing the role of a no-nonsense, ass-kicking cowboy who used the Iron Claw finisher to full effect, Blackjack would find a lot of success. Enough success to see him pretty quickly become a top contender to then WWF World Champion Pedro Morales. But it wasn't just professional victories he was undergoing at this time, as over in his personal life, he and his longtime partner Julia would soon be welcoming 3 children into the world too, with these being Barry Clinton, Kendall Wayne, and Stephanie. So with all of them at home watching their father on TV, he'd feel even more pressure to succeed, something he did to an even greater degree when, in the early 1970s, he'd form a tag team with Blackjack Lanza, which would go on to become known as the Blackjacks. And together then they'd become one of the most feared duos not only in WWF, where they became tag team champions, but also throughout the entire territory circuit as well. Perhaps this is why, seeing everything his father had been able to achieve, Barry would decide he wanted to follow in his footsteps too as the late 1970s rolled around, something which led him to hitting the ring himself under the tutelage of his old man. And as it happened, this training would show him to be something of a prodigy. So by the time it got to November of 1979 then, he was more than ready to compete for the first time when he took on J.J. Dillon in San Angelo, Texas. But he wasn't the only one making his start in the industry at this point as, elsewhere, Lawrence Michael Rotunda, the husband of Barry's sister Stephanie, would also have decided that he wanted to follow his father-in-law's footsteps. So over the next few years then, he'd find early success in the likes of German promotion Lutte Internationale, as well as various American territories such as Jim Crockett Promotions and Championship Wrestling from Florida. Come 1984, though, Mike would decide to put his singles career on pause when he formed a tag team with his brother-in-law Barry called the US Express, a team which would go on to win the NWA Florida United States Tag Team Championship on 3 separate occasions between March and May of that year. And while they were doing this, Blackjack was also continuing to find success, now as a singles performer when he became both the NWA United States Heavyweight Champion and a Mid-Atlantic Tag Team Champion with Ric Flair. So with all this success under his belt then, it only made sense that later that year, Vince McMahon Jr. would come calling, with him hoping to add the territory star to his ever-growing roster here as he continued his push towards going national. But he wasn't the only Windham who would join the roster at this point, as Bray and Mike Rotunda would also be brought in, with Vince giving them a major push here as, aside from getting to appear at WrestleMania 1 and be the first act to use what would later on become Hulk Hogan's Real American theme, they'd also become two-time tag team champions. Unfortunately though, by 1986, not only would Blackjack be on the verge of retirement from the ring, but the US Express would have parted ways with WWF so as to return to the territory circuit. That said, there, while working for the likes of the AWA and Jim Crockett Promotions, they'd continue to build up an even greater reputation, with Bray in particular breaking out as a singles star around this time after he had a series of excellent matches against Ric Flair. But of course, there was another Windham who had been waiting in the wings the whole time, someone who, by the middle of the decade, had finally decided it was their moment to break into the business themselves. And that was why, right as his big brother was becoming a top guy in Jim Crockett Promotions, Kendall Windham would hit the ring for the first time too, making a quick impact here as he rose up the ranks of Championship Wrestling from Florida between 1985 and 1987, all before then jumping over to Crockett 2 and becoming a popular mid-card presence there. And while on occasion he would team with his brother, Bray would have largely moved to a far bigger level by this point as, after spending a cup of coffee in WWF working as the Widowmaker, he'd return to the now newly rebranded World Championship Wrestling, where he'd become a member of arguably the most popular and successful incarnation of the Four Horsemen. So now with the backing of Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, and J.J. Dillon, Windham would become an overnight heel sensation, a role which allowed him to regularly appear in big-time matches against the likes of Sting and Brian Pillman. That said, when Ric Flair briefly left WCW at the turn of the decade, the oldest son of Blackjack Mulligan would find himself switching to the babyface side once more when, upon being booted out of the Four Horsemen for failing to bring the world title back home at 1991's Great American Bash, he'd form a new tag team with Dustin Rhodes. And while he was doing this, his former tag team partner Mike Rotunda was finding similar levels of success back up in the tag division in New York, as after he and his wife Stephanie gave birth to their first son, Wyndham Lawrence, in May of 1987, and their second son, Taylor Michael, in May of 1990, he'd rebrand himself as Irwin R. Shyster and form a new duo with the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase named Money Inc. So with this leading to him getting 2 more runs with the WWF tag team titles between 1992 and 1993 then, it would be left up to his brother-in-law down south to try and one-up him once more. And this was something he was ultimately able to do when, after spending a spell as the WCW World Television Champion and then a unified WCW and NWA World Tag Team Champion, he'd finally reached the top of the mountain when, at Super Brawl 3 on February 21, 1993, he'd defeat the Great Muta to become the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion. But what was happening to Kendall at this time, we hear you ask? Well, never being able to achieve the same level of success as either his brother or his brother-in-law, he'd instead have to settle for bouncing around a number of different places, with these brief stopover spots including the likes of Championship Wrestling from Florida and All Japan Pro Wrestling. And that would bring us to the mid-90s where, while Mike Rotunda was continuing to fill a role on the WWF mid-card as IRS, getting to feud with the likes of Razor Ramon and The Undertaker but never rising any higher, Barry Windham's run on top was about to come to a crushing end. Yes, it was after losing the NWA World's Heavyweight title to Ric Flair at July 18, 1993's Beach Blast that he would injure his knee, forcing him to spend a year on the shelf and lose much of the momentum he'd built up by then. And to make matters worse, when he finally came back from his injury at May 22, 1994's Slamboree, he immediately hurt himself again, with this causing him to disappear from sight for the next 2 years. That's right, things weren't looking good for the Windham family overall. And while Barry was out undergoing a lengthy recovery, the situation would get even worse for his brother-in-law Mike, as by July of 1995, he'd be gone from WWF. Then, as if that wasn't bad enough, Kendall would undergo further problems of his own around this time, as no matter where he showed up, whether it be another brief spell in WCW in 1993 or a cup of coffee in Extreme Championship Wrestling in 1995, it felt like no one was willing to take him on for the long haul. Thankfully then, this was also around the time that Eric Bischoff had taken over WCW and was looking to bolster up its ranks with anyone who had once been a star in WWF. So, not long after he'd parted ways with Vince McMahon, Rotunda would be signed up to an all-new contract down in Atlanta where, now working under the gimmick of VK Wall Street, he'd continue to fill up a mid-card role and get to earn a big paycheck while he was doing it. And so, with the NWO soon becoming the all-encompassing thing in WCW, he'd even get swallowed up by this too, with him joining the group in December of 1996 and there reuniting with his old tag team partner Ted DiBiase. Meanwhile, as that was happening, Barry Windham would be getting a second lease on life when, in 1996, after being cleared to hit the ring once more, WWF would bring him in to play the role of the Stalker, a camouflage face paint-clad babyface whose most notable moment was a brief feud with Goldust. That said, while it wasn't a great gimmick, it would give him a foot in the door enough to when, in February of 1997, at the point the company were looking for someone to pair Justin Hawk Bradshaw up with, Barry would be chosen, as the two from there went on to form the new Blackjacks, with this of course being a reference to his father's old team. Unlike his father during his prime though, by this point in his career, the oldest Windham son was feeling the wear and tear of the years on the road, and so with him not being able to go to the same level he once had, his stock would never rise any higher under Vince McMahon's watch, and by May of 1998, he'd have once again left the company. Luckily for him though, he still had an in at WCW, as well he had by that point moved over to New Japan Pro Wrestling to become a member of NWO Japan. VK Wall Street still had the ear of the right people back in Atlanta, enough to where he could get his brother-in-law a job. And he wasn't the only one he was able to get a job for, as, around the same time, Kendall Windham would also get signed up by Eric Bischoff, with this bringing the whole family under the same banner again for the first time in years. So for the rest of the decade then, things would continue on in this manner, with both siblings becoming members of the West Texas Rednecks alongside Curt Hennig right up until 1999, at which point they would be released from the company. But with each of them in the latter phase of the careers by this point, it didn't bother the brothers too much, as after jumping around the indie scene for the first part of the new decade, at one point winning tag team gold together in Puerto Rico for the World Wrestling Council, both Barry and Kendall would decide it was time to start easing into retirement. And the same would happen for their brother-in-law Mike Rotunda too at this point, something which led to him hanging up his boots and securing a job as a backstage road agent with WWE instead, a job he would maintain for several years thereafter. So with the doors to New York being open to the Windham family once more then, it gave the company the opportunity to finally honor the patriarch of the family when, in April of 2006, both Blackjack Mulligan and his tag partner Blackjack Lanza were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. After that, though, things would go quiet for a while as, with only Mike Rotunda occasionally being featured on screen during WWE TV now, and Kendall leaving the industry altogether so as to start a security business, it felt like the era of the Windham family may finally be over. Of course, what no one realized at the time was that Rotunda's two children, Windham and Taylor, each had ambitions of following in their father's footsteps too. And that eventually led to a situation where, after each had made a name for themselves taking part in both football and amateur wrestling while at high school, they both start training in the ways of the ring as the 2010s were coming to a close. But while Taylor would be the first to get signed up to a WWE developmental contract in 2008, from there changing his name to Tank Rotunda and spending a period in Florida Championship Wrestling where he became both a Florida Tag Team Champion and Florida Heavyweight Champion, it would be his brother Windham who first found greater success. And that was because, after spending a brief period down in FCW himself, he'd be called up to the main roster as part of the Nexus storyline in 2010. Unfortunately for him though, by the time he got there, the Nexus had already crashed and burned, and so just a year later, he'd be sent back down to developmental where, forced to put his creativity to use, he'd begin developing the character of Bray Wyatt, a Bayou cult leader who often spoke in rhymes and riddles, and who quickly captured the attention of audiences down in Florida. Meanwhile, as he was doing this, his brother, who had now been rebranded as Bo Dallas, would find much success of his own, as with FCW morphing into NXT, he'd become that brand's heavyweight champion for a while, all as he was developing a character which saw him play a delusional heel who thought himself the babyface despite the reaction he was getting from fans. And so, with this also marking the point that Barry Windham would get inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame himself as part of the Four Horsemen in 2012, it looked like the Windham family was finally getting the rebirth it deserved. But of course, for as successful as Bo Dallas was in NXT, it was still Bray Wyatt who was the one really gaining momentum. As with him by now having built an army around him in the form of the Wyatt family, the question began getting asked, when would his main roster call-up come? And the answer to that, as it turned out, would be in May of 2013, as it was then that a series of vignettes started appearing on WWE TV, hyping up the imminent arrival of the stable. So when they eventually did debut later that summer, fans were more than ready for them, and more than ready for Wyatt in particular, as with his magnetic charisma, he was able to go from hated heel to something of an anti-hero. Yes, despite clearly being positioned as the villain during his feuds against the likes of Kane and Daniel Bryan over the months which followed, fans started getting behind the cult leader more and more. And this would all climax at WrestleMania 30 the following year when, as he was stepping into the ring with John Cena, he'd conduct the entire crowd into having a sing-along of "He's got the whole world in his hands." Unfortunately though, this match would also mark the start of a recurring pattern for Bray, as after losing to Big Match John, he'd begin to develop a reputation for someone who couldn't get the job done and who, whenever he was placed against a bigger star, would end up looking at the lights come the end of the night. And things wouldn't be going much better for his brother at this point either, because after his main roster call-up in April of 2014, Vince McMahon would apparently not see the value in his Bo Leave gimmick, with the boss instead filing Bo away right into the lower mid-card. Then, in a further blow for the whole family, on April 7, 2016, Blackjack Mulligan would die after having a series of health problems over the months prior, leaving the family without its patriarch for the first time ever. So while Bo Dallas was floundering in comedy groups such as the Social Outcasts and the Miztourage, Bray Wyatt would decide that, in order to preserve his family's legacy, he would need to do something drastic. And this drastic act would be to completely reinvent himself when, after the Bayou cult leader had been well and truly buried following a series of high-profile losses, he'd take some time away to be with his wife, backstage interviewer JoJo, all while at the same time, he was developing a whole new gimmick for himself. Then, in April 2019, after months of inactivity, Bray would finally return to WWE via a series of bizarre Mr. Rogers-style backstage segments where, speaking directly from his Firefly Funhouse, he'd tell all of the fans watching that he was coming. And pretty soon it became apparent that he was none other than the Fiend, a horror movie villain dropped right into the wrestling world who, with a mask designed by makeup legend Tom Savini and an absolutely killer entrance, soon became the most over thing in the company. Unfortunately though, despite being so massively over with fans, what would happen next would do more harm to the character than good, as rather than have the Fiend be a looming threat over the entire roster, Vince McMahon would rush him to the main event scene where, in a subsequent feud with Seth Rollins, he not only killed all his opponent's babyface heat, but also did serious damage to the very concept of Hell in a Cell. Of course, with Bray being as creative as he was still able to make the most of this situation, giving us high points here such as his Firefly Funhouse match against John Cena at WrestleMania 36. That said, with the increasing butting of heads which was going on backstage between him and McMahon, things would continue to go sour to the point where, in July of 2021, the boss eventually decided to cut bait on him altogether when he released him from his contract. And to make matters worse for the Windham family, not only was Bray without a job now, but as a result of a neck injury, Bo Dallas would be forced to retire from in-ring competition too. But even if both brothers were now, for the time being at least, done with WWE, the family still got a chance to live on in the form of SmackDown Women's Champion Liv Morgan, as she's been in a relationship with Bo for some time by then. Of course, if the heavy speculation is true though, Liv won't be the only member of the Windham family in the company for long, because with so much being made of the White Rabbit viral marketing campaign that seems to be playing out across WWE right now, it's assumed that all of this is leading up towards the return of Bray Wyatt once more. The only question left then is, when he does come back, what form will it be in? Will it be the Bayou cult leader? Will it be the Fiend? Or will it, as some people suspect, be an entirely different third incarnation, something fans have yet to be introduced to, but which, given his track record already, will no doubt blow them away when they finally do see it? And yes, well, at the time of this video's recording, we don't have the answers to any of these questions yet. What we are sure of is that no matter what form Bray presents himself in this time, it'll only further solidify the Windham legacy as being one of the greats. And that's because, with the talent they each have and the combined titles they've held, it's really impossible to argue that, if there's ever a Hall of Fame for wrestling families, whoever's in charge of this should know enough to instantly let them in. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.